So I thought I'd talk today about how this economy is making people crazy. And desperate times lead people to do desperate things. And I think it's an exciting time. And I think there's a lot of doom and gloom about the economy. But for creative people and for creative leaders, I think it's a really exciting time in corporate America because everybody's out there looking for the secret sauce that's going to make them get ahead of the competitors and actually make some money in this economy. And I think more and more these leaders who aren't particularly creative are seeing that this could be the way out. And so they're actually giving creative leaders a platform, and they're actually being heard, which I think is great. So IBM recently did a poll of 1,500 of its nearest and dearest customers, and they said, what's the biggest challenge facing you today as a corporation? And the number one thing that came back is everybody said complexity. The complexity of the problems that we're having to deal with and we're having to solve for is the number one thing that keeps us up at night. But the number two thing that came up on the list was creativity, which is interesting that that came up right behind it because obviously they realized that to solve these complex problems, they really need different thinking and out-of-the-box thinking. Now, another study came out, which actually someone from Penn was one of the authors of, Jennifer Muller, and this study said that even though corporations say they want creativity, when creative ideas are actually pitched, everybody gets nervous and runs the other way and goes with the same old, same old. So I think right now we're at this sort of interesting time where, it's starting to take foot, sort of like this change, I think, in corporate America. And I think one of the problems is people are very uncomfortable with the word creativity. But when we talk about creativity as a business tool, it's not paste and crayons and, cutting construction paper. It's actually creativity that's rooted in really solid business strategy. And I can tell you that for what I do for MTV Networks and Viacom, before we ever sit down to brainstorm an idea, we've done a ton of work looking through research, figuring out who our target audience is, figuring out what our message is going to be. And we do all that beforehand so that when we go into brainstorm, it's actually very targeted and very strategic. It's interesting, Peter brought up Apple because I think Apple is such a great example of, really when you strip it down, what is it? It's creativity as applied to technology. And that's what Steve Jobs was so great at, right? Because he brought that together. And what happens is you really create this emotional bond, I think, when you inject creativity into your business with the consumer. And so I teach at NYU, I teach undergrads, and I always try to get out there like the importance of brands and the emotional connection that people have with brands. And so I always ask the question, I say, how many of you would be sad if Motorola went out of business tomorrow? Right? Nobody raises their hand. So then you say, well, how many of you would be sad if Apple went out of business tomorrow? And you hear like audible gasps in the room and all the hands go up. But that's it, right? Like that's the emotional connection that people have with that brand. And I think, if you strip the creativity out, you get a company like Microsoft, right? Which is not a bad company, certainly has made a lot of money. But it's just a very different thing. It's a very different relationship that customers have with that brand. Google is another one. Actually, their homepage is really subversive in its white space. If you think about when it came on the scene, it was Yahoo. Could they fit one more thing on that page, right? It's so jam-packed. And you got to know that they're like desperately wanting to put ads on the Google homepage and desperately trying not to do it. But, it's really subversive with that white space. Yet, the only time I ever hear anybody talk about Google is when they do something really creative, right? Like they had the tribute to Freddie Mercury, or they did the thing with Les Paul where you could play the guitar. And it becomes a very different connection with the user. I was at a conference a few weeks ago in Arizona, and the creative director of Kleenex spoke, which sounds really boring, but she was fascinating. Because she had been pushing Kleenex for 4 years to change what they do. They were losing market share. She was like, nobody was buying tissues. Everybody uses Starbucks napkins. And so they were like, we got to do something. So finally, after 4 years of her pushing, she said, we could do ovals and we could do all this stuff. And they said, oh, our machines only make square boxes. That was literally the answer. But finally, I think they just were like, you know what, we're losing so much market share, let's do it. So she had, they have the ovals now. You've probably seen them in the stores. They do these triangles. They did watermelon for the summer. They're doing this for Christmas. And they have where you can actually design your own box online. And they have, they're actually charging more for the product and selling less in these containers, yet they've gained market share with all this, which obviously is, the proof is in the pudding. And then lastly, I thought I'd talk about an example from my world, which is interesting because I didn't know your book was coming out, but it's all about content theft. So as we were talking about in the beginning, obviously content theft is a big problem for media companies. And notice I did not say piracy because Johnny Depp made pirates cool. So content theft is a big problem, and the problem is that, frankly, a lot of people who work in the entertainment industry, they, rip CDs and do all those things that, you wouldn't want them to do because it's billions of dollars of lost revenue. So Washington actually really didn't care about the problem until fairly recently, when they realized that a lot of the money that was being made was funding terrorism. And that suddenly Washington was like, oh, we do care about this. And so the entertainment companies knew legislation was going to come up for a vote, and they started creativeamerica.org. And all the entertainment companies came together, and they wanted all their employees to join to show Washington that it's not all about George Clooney. There's thousands of regular people making their living in entertainment. But we had to make our employees care to want to join. So 2 weeks ago, all the media companies were supposed to do their best push to get people to join. And at Viacom, the CEO of Viacom had sent an email out in May asking people to join, and I won't tell you the numbers, but the response was minimal, let's put it that way. So we knew we had to do something different. So we said we have to talk to people in a way that they'll understand, and we want to talk about, it means lost jobs, it means money out of your pocket. And the great example is actually from NBC, the show Heroes, which some of you may remember. More people watch that show illegally than legally. And so the question becomes, if everyone had been watching that legally, would that show still be in production? And all those people would still have jobs, the actors, the grips, all that stuff. So we decided to do it with our content. So we took, South Park and SpongeBob, which had been watched like almost 3 billion times illegally in the last few years. And we made it really relevant for our population. And you could, when you joined, you got a T-shirt. We did these fun T-shirts, and our whole campaign was "You've just been robbed," and so we did clings on the bathroom mirrors that had an arrow down to the person washing their hands that said "Victim of content theft," and gave them, the address of where to join. But our big thing was we did a day, and all 8,000 Viacom employees who walked into work on the Wednesday were handed a half a muffin. And it said, looks like someone stole a chunk. And so it talked about, how this isn't the only time you're going to get ripped off today. And it, talked about money coming out of their pocket. And let me tell you, this got everybody talking. We had a huge response. And when the numbers came out last week, we were really happy because, like I said, all the media companies, Fox, NBC, everybody did it, and we had the highest response rate. 37% of the people who signed up were from Viacom, which we were really happy about. So I want to leave you with this quote. It's from a book called Juicing the Orange, which I really like, and it's about injecting creativity into your business strategy, and it's brilliant execution without brilliant strategy is irrelevant. Brilliant strategy without brilliant execution is invisible. And that's sort of the mantra I take away from the creative economy. Thank you.